it gives me great pleasure to introduce Stephen Snelling to you. Many of you will have read his invaluable book on the VCs of Gallipoli. Stephen is based in Norfolk. He is a Norwich City fan. We've already ascertained that. Been a writer journalist for nearly 50 years, working as a sports editor, feature editor, magazine editor. And he is an author of 8 books, including one on the Victoria Cross recipients of the Gallipoli campaign, and most recently, a study of the V Beach landings, the Wooden Horse of Gallipoli. And if he wishes to shamelessly advertise that, he's very welcome at the end, because Stephen, like all of our speakers, is giving his services gratis, and which we're very welcome. To hand over to Stephen, who's going to talk about Gallipoli gallantry, consistent courage, inconsistent recognition.
Thank you, Ian, and thank you very much for inviting me to give this talk. The subject really, I should say, is not looking at the whole of all of the Victoria Cross recipients, nor all of the actions, but to look at a few particular cases which I think show up this question of consistent courage and consistent recognition. Before I begin, I'd just like to give a little statistical background and some context. During the course of the Gallipoli campaign, from the initial naval operations in February through to the evacuation, the active operations against Turkey resulted in the award of 39 Victoria Crosses, of which 36 were in respect of actions that took place between April 25th, from the landings, that is, until the end of August. During that same period, only 24 were given for acts of valour elsewhere, mostly on the Western Front, which to my mind suggests either a degree of largesse so far as Sir Ian Hamilton was concerned, or a particular ferocity, or the particular ferocity of the fighting on Gallipoli, or possibly a combination of the two. Certainly it's true to say that aside from the naval operations at Zeebrugge and Ostend in 1918, there were no other instances of multiple VCs on such a scale as those that recognised the landings at W Beach, V Beach, or the seizure of the Lone Pine position in August. None of that's to suggest that the crosses which were not fully earned or justified. It's just a peculiarity of the Gallipoli campaign. As for the cases I'm focusing on tonight, some of the issues are unique to Gallipoli, but not all. Also, I should add that some of the arguments put forward are necessarily speculative because the documentation relating to the awards cannot be found, or in many cases no longer survives. I'll just move on to the first of the pictures, and many of you will be familiar with this, which shows the landing by the Lancashire Fusiliers on W Beach on April 25th, 1915. It's the artist's impression, which shows Captain Willis, Raymond Willis, with the walking stick, urging on his men as they come ashore from the open boats, faced with the barbed wire between them and the heights above. I start this talk then with a letter dated April 27th, 1915, written by the General Officer commanding 29th Division, Aylmer Hunter Weston. He wrote, "We have managed it. We have achieved the impossible. We are established on the south end of the Gallipoli Peninsula. Wonderful gallantry on the part of regimental officers and men has done it. On the 25th, the Lancashire Fusiliers on W Beach did under my eyes the most marvellous feat in landing in boats on an open beach which was covered with a broad belt of barbed wire and fired on by machine guns from both flanks and by riflemen from deep trenches, dominating it all round." The story of this particular action soon becomes part of military folklore, really, as the 6 VCs before breakfast. it's really all about a particular rule that governed the awards of the Victoria Cross, of which there were a number of rules. And this one concerns rule number 13, which I've called sort of lucky for some. And it reads, or in part reads, this particular rule: in the event of a gallant and daring act having been performed by a squadron, ship's company, a detached body of seamen and marines not under 50 in number, or by a brigade, regiment, troop or company, in which the admiral, general or other officer commanding such forces may deem that all are equally brave and distinguished and no special selection can be made by them, then the admiral, general or other officer commanding may direct that for any such body of seamen or marines, or for every troop or company of soldiers, one officer shall be selected by the officers engaged for the decoration, and in like manner, one petty officer or NCO shall be selected by the petty officers and NCOs engaged, and two seamen or private soldiers or marines shall be selected by the seamen or private soldiers or marines engaged respectively. This particular rule was used extensively during the Indian Mutiny of 1857. 5 members of the Bengal Artillery were so awarded during the relief of Lucknow, as were 5 members of the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders. 4 members of the 8th Hussars were so awarded the VC at Gwalior during the mutiny suppression. This particular rule wasn't employed again until the Second Boer War, when 4 members of Kew Battery, Royal Horse Artillery, were honoured for saving the guns at Cornspruit. So never before had 6 VCs been awarded by ballot to a single unit under the terms of this warrant. But that was what was about to happen when Major General Aylmer Hunter Weston recommended on May the 15th, 1915, in respect of what he called a deed of heroism that has seldom been equalled. He strongly recommended that the battalion's feat of arms be recognised by the bestowal of 6 VCs on the 2 most distinguished officers and 4 most distinguished NCOs and men. He wrote, "Where all did so marvellously, it is difficult to discriminate, but the opinion of the battalion is that Bromley and Willis are the officers, Stubbs, Richards, Grimshaw and Keneally are the NCOs and men to whom the greatest credit is due." His recommendation was endorsed by Sir Ian Hamilton, although acknowledging that this might appear excessive, he noted that only one other VC recommendation had been made for the southern landing. This was not entirely accurate, of course, although possibly true at the time he wrote. There would in fact be 3 more to the army and 6 to the navy in time. So how was this selection arrived at? The War Office certainly interpreted the recommendation as being under the warrant Rule 13. As such, and under those terms of the warrant, a ballot of survivors should have been held, but there was no suggestion that any such vote had taken place. Rather, that the opinion of this commanding officer had been sought and soundings taken. Hence, the recommendation was returned to Hamilton with a request that a vote be carried out. And this was on June the 11th. Hunter Weston responded 4 weeks later, stating that as an act of collective gallantry, he had taken action under Rule 13, and that Richard Willis, Alfred Richards, William Keneally were the men to be honoured, plus John Grimshaw in place of a second private. Grimshaw was a lance corporal at the time. Apparently this was at the request of the privates themselves. Still not clear if a formal ballot had taken place, the problem being that so few of the men with the unit at that time had been through the actual landing. Hamilton endorsed the first 3, but omitted Grimshaw, presumably on the grounds that the recommendation didn't comply with the terms of the warrant. In other words, he was an NCO and not a second private. These were accepted and the awards announced in August. This was to the 3 men, and we'll just go through some of the pictures. This shows the actual scene of the landing. This was taken from the Lancashire Fusiliers annual. Here we have Raymond Willis and his wife and son. Alfred Richards wearing his Victoria Cross, the sergeant who lost a leg as a result of the landing, and William Keneally. Now, these three were accepted in August, and the other three obviously fell by the wayside at that stage. They were announced, as I say, in August, and what that was how things might have remained, but for the intervention and persistence of General Woolley Dodd, himself a Lancashire Fusiliers officer, who had succeeded to the command of the 86th Brigade, of which the Fusiliers were a part, on April the 25th. A year after the evacuation of the peninsula, he raised the question of the awards again. He maintained that under the provisions of Clause 13, or Rule 13, the scale of awards should have been larger, referring as it did to 4 VCs per company, not per battalion. He also pointed out that he felt that Hunter Weston was probably originally thinking in terms of Rule 7, which allowed for a general officer who actually witnessed the actions to make an award himself on the spot, subject to confirmation. Now, this all led to a great deal of confusion and concern in the War Office, and the official response was that in fact an additional officer, NCO, and 3 privates could be honoured, which would have taken obviously the figure from not just 6 VCs before breakfast, but we would have then risen to 8 VCs before breakfast. But the decision was taken to deliberately bend, or rather break, the rules and to allow a second NCO instead of the 3 privates. So in this case, you had Grimshaw coming back into play, Bromley and Stubbs. So you're back to the original 6 people who'd been recommended. All of this was done without another ballot. Indeed, I'm not sure there was ever a ballot of any substance, which would have been nigh impossible by 1917, as so few members of the battalion had survived from the Gallipoli campaign. But it begs the question who and how many could have received the VC had Rule 13 been properly followed. 6 VCs before breakfast could have been a dozen VCs. So it just makes you think, and what makes you wonder what goes on in terms of some of these recommendations and how history could be very different. We just go on through the pictures and we see that the second 3 VCs here, Grimshaw, Stubbs and Bromley, by this time, well, Stubbs had died on the April 25th, so his was a posthumous award. Bromley, who succeeded to command of the Lancashire Fusiliers, was subsequently wounded in the Gully Ravine fighting of late June, and was returning to Gallipoli on the Royal Edward when it was torpedoed and sunk, and he was lost. So his VC became posthumous too. The only survivor was Grimshaw, who by this time was in England and had been awarded the Distinguished Conduct Medal in lieu of his VC recommendation in 1915, and was surprised to learn that that had been cancelled in 1917 and that he'd been given a Victoria Cross instead. This is Grimshaw later in the war. He'd been commissioned by then to 2nd Lieutenant. He went on to become a Lieutenant Colonel in the Lancashire Fusiliers and a recruiting officer, and served most of his life in the military. Now we come to the second kind of, to me, an interesting set of circumstances that concerned a number of Gallipoli VC winners. And this section might be called Persistence Pays Off. As we've just seen, the influence of senior officers can be crucial in turning recommendations into awards of the Victoria Cross that might otherwise have fallen by the wayside. Indeed, it was the persistence of officers that was a deciding factor in two other cases which might have gone unrecognised. Walter Parker, who's pictured here, a Royal Marine medic, and David Lauder, seen here, of the 1st 4th Royal Scots Fusiliers. In the case of Parker, his bravery during the defence of the Anzac beachhead, the original recommendation was evidently lost along with a number of other dispatches during the course of the campaign. It was only as a result of a chance conversation between his senior officer and the Royal Marine Brigade's staff captain in 1916 that the recommendation was resuscitated and evidence collected all over again. Luckily for them and for Parker, many of the key witnesses had survived the campaign and were willing to testify to his gallantry. More than that, they found powerful allies in Brigadier General Trotman, who had commanded the brigade on Gallipoli, and in the form of the Adjutant General of the Royal Marines. Having been resubmitted, the award was finally made in June 1917. In David Lauder's case, we can only speculate that something similar must have happened, since his action during a bombing duel in the vineyard fighting of August 1915 was not honoured until January 1917. The known circumstances are these. During the defence of the vineyard, he was engaged in a bombing duel in the course of which a bomb he threw caught the parapet and rolled back. Shouting a warning, he put his foot on it to save others. In the explosion, his foot was blown off and leg shattered, but miraculously he survived, though his right leg had to be amputated below the knee. For what his officer called the pluckiest thing he'd seen, Lauder was awarded the Serbian Medal for bravery, but nothing more. And I can only imagine it was the persistent efforts of his officers to right an obvious injustice that resulted in the delayed award almost 18 months later. It was similar persistence, although not this time by officers, but by the parents of Arthur Tisdall, who we'll see here, that ensured his award nearly a year after the action it honoured. His selfless action in rescuing wounded from V Beach on April 25th had been witnessed by many, but as the only officer from the Anson battalion aboard the River Clyde, no one had thought to recommend him. Indeed, few of those who witnessed his actions knew who he was. It was only following his death a short while after that reports of his gallantry came to the notice of his parents in the form of letters from fellow officers and men. Determined to have his gallantry recognised, Tisdall's parents wrote to as many surviving officers to seek their support for a recommendation, as well as lobbying senior officers. The result was a formal examination of the case that resulted not only in a Victoria Cross for Tisdall, but conspicuous gallantry medals for 3 of his men who had assisted him. There was, however, one name missing from the list of honours. Leading seaman Fred Curtis had shared in the rescue effort, but had subsequently been killed in action during the Third Battle of Krithia on June 4th, 1915. Under the rules then in existence, no award other than a Victoria Cross or a mention in dispatches could be awarded posthumously. So he and his family missed out on the award of a conspicuous gallantry medal that his actions undoubtedly merited, and which would unquestionably have been awarded had the recommendation been made in the normal course of events immediately after the landing. So timing here was everything. And this is a picture, an artist impression of Tisdall. This appeared in a book, contemporary book called Deeds That Thrill the Empire. Now we come on to another section of interest to me, and this concerns some of the naval awards, which I think are even more inconsistent than most of the army awards. This section might be called One is Enough. Study of the naval VCs of the Gallipoli campaign throws up a number of inconsistencies, not least in the speed of awards, where some, including those resulting from the initial landings, took 4 months to be gazetted. Those involving some submariners took just a matter of days. More serious was the matter of official parsimony when it came to recognizing feats of daring and instances peculiar to the Royal Navy in preferring to mark acts of gallantry with promotion or advancement, as they call it, rather than honours. Such was the case with Eric Robinson, who's pictured here. Recommended for a VC for his courage in charge of a landing party demolishing Turkish gun positions in February, and in command of trawlers engaged in minesweeping operations the following month prior to the landings, he subsequently performed what many considered one of the bravest acts of the Dardanelles operations, the destruction by torpedo attack of the stranded and captured submarine E-15, for which he received no award at all beyond promotion. This shows him, this is one of the actions that led to his Victoria Cross. This was in February. And this shows the much more celebrated action, which was the attack on the E-15 by picket boats, volunteer crews from the Majestic and Triumph, which was led by Robinson. It involved the loss of one of them, and Robinson's boat picked up the survivors. In fact, everyone survived bar one man. But anyway, the interesting thing here is that Robinson received no award for this action, which many felt was much more significant than the actions which actually had earned him the Victoria Cross, while one of his junior officers engaged in this particular attack on the E-15 received the DSO, and every surviving seaman was decorated with a Distinguished Service Medal. Now, much the same approach by the Admiralty seems to have been applied to the Submariner VCs, Edward Boyle of the E-14 and Martin Nasmyth of the E-11. This one shows Edward Boyle. We can see him here standing on the conning tower with his officers and the crew of E-14 with him. This is an artist's impression of one of his more celebrated attacks during his patrol into the Sea of Marmara. This shows the attack on a Turkish transport, which in fact turned out to be rather inaccurate. He was credited with sinking this particular transport with the loss of many hundreds of Turkish troops, but in fact the transport survived and managed to limp into port. And this one picture shows Martin Nasmyth, probably the most celebrated of all the submariners in the campaign. Now, both men were awarded VCs for their daring and hugely successful first patrols into the Sea of Marmara through April and May 1915, and both went unrecognized for their subsequent patrols, 2 each, despite the fact that Turkish defenses had been significantly strengthened when they returned and continued their operations later in the campaign. In the case of Nasmyth in particular, the failure to honour his actions with at least a DSO and bar is puzzling, if not inexplicable, to my mind, especially when set against the largesse shown to Q-ship captains in their fight against German submarines. If we consider some of these subsequent patrols, during his second, straddling August and September, he scored the greatest success of the naval campaign, sinking the Turkish battleship Barbarossa, as well as instigating a commando-style operation to blow a gap in the Izmit railway linking Turkey to the peninsula. If anything, his third patrol, carried out between November and December 1915, was even more remarkable. As well as being at 47 days the largest incursion into the Marmara, it was also one of the most successful of all, his tally amounting to a destroyer, 11 steamers, and 35 other craft at a time when Turkish defensive measures were stronger than at any other period of the struggle. In spite of all that, he had carried out a second audacious attack into Constantinople harbour itself and brought his submarines safely through all the nets, minefields, and past all the coastal defences lining both sides of the Dardanelles. To my mind, if that wasn't worth at least a DSO, I'm not sure what is. But he got nothing for it. Pictures here show before they reached the Dardanelles. This shows the crew of E11 with Nasmyth seated in the middle at the top on the conning tower. On his left is his second in command, Dolly Hughes, who carried out the commando-style operation when he swam ashore and blew up the railway, for which he received DSO. This shows an artist's impression of his Nasmyth's first attack on Constantinople. And these were pictures taken by Nasmyth during his first patrol, captured vessels, searches that took place, destruction of similar vessels, and the damage sustained to one of their periscopes, which was hit by a Turkish shell. And we come to the next bit in a minute. Taking into account all the circumstances of the subsequent operations, there is, I believe, reason to say that Nasmyth, like Robinson before him, was unfortunate not to have received a bar to his Victoria Cross. Logic and straightforward examination of their exploits would, in my opinion, surely have suggested a grave injustice was done to both men. To have received no British honour at all for their subsequent feats of daring serves only to highlight the extraordinary inconsistency in the Admiralty system for rewarding acts of gallantry, in my view, during the First World War. Now we come on to another case of, to me, a sort of sense of inconsistency. And I accept that there's always going to be, wherever human beings are involved, there's going to be some kind of inconsistency, and especially in when it comes to awards. But this one was so, to me, sort of interesting that it is worthy of consideration at least. We might call this one Lone Pine versus Hill 60. So we come to this story, and this concerns particularly the Anzacs, if you like, or the Australians in particular here, for a further case of inconsistency. And this has continues to baffle me. I first researched these actions back in the 1990s, and I've kind of returned to it from time to time. I think that there may be something to be said for the fact that, to a certain extent, there was a situation where you have the Australian and New Zealanders in particular were, as well, mostly were citizen soldiers, if you like. They were probably not used to the idea of recommendations. They certainly were probably not aware of the whole process, or of the rules governing various awards. You have this strange situation where only one New Zealander received a Victoria Cross during the entire campaign. And there is a certain inconsistency, as I say, about the way that the Australians dealt with their recommendations. This particular one concerns two actions which bear considerable similarity to one another, but which had very different outcomes so far as honours and awards are concerned. The first took place during the desperate fight to hang on to the gains made during the action, which was a sort of incredibly brave attack on the Turkish Lone Pine defences, one of the strongest Turkish positions at Anzac. It took place in early August 1915. The struggle resulted in no fewer than 7 awards of the Victoria Cross, which was, other than possibly the attack on Zeebrugge and Ostend in 1918, I can't think of another instance where so many awards were given for such a relatively small operation. Of those 7, 4 of them went to a single unit, the 7th Victoria Battalion of the Australian Infantry Force, or Imperial Force. And in this instance, we're concerned with 3 of these. They concern Lieutenant Fred Tubb and Corporals Alex Burton and William Dunstan. And this particular artist's impression, again taken from Deeds That Thrill the Empire, a contemporary publication devoted to acts of gallantry during the first 3 years or so of the First World War, depicts Tubb leading his company into Lone Pine. And as I say, the position had largely been, or the vast majority of the position had been captured by this stage, and reinforcements were sent in to hold it against a succession of Turkish counterattacks. And Tubb is seen here directing his men while they build sandbag barriers in some of the trenches. Now, that particular action took place in trying to defend a trench barrier known as Goldenstedt's barricade. And Tubb and about 10 others spent a harrowing night fighting off repeated Turkish counterattacks, at the same time as constantly rebuilding the sandbag barrier in the face of a hail of grenades that threatened to flatten both the barrier and to destroy the Australians' precarious grip on the position. There had already been constant fighting for more than 2 days in this particular position. And in one of the actions, another officer from the 7th Battalion, a chap called Lieutenant William Simmons, I'm not sure of the pronunciation, although Sarah, who I think is listening, will know better than me, as she's the granddaughter. He was ordered by his commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Pompey Elliott, to restore a dangerous situation. He was actually handed by Pompey Elliott his revolver and sent off. And Pompey Elliott said something to the effect of, "Look, I don't expect to see you alive again, but we need you to hold this position at all costs." He went off, held the position at all costs, single-handedly at times holding off the Turkish attacks, and was subsequently awarded a well-deserved Victoria Cross as a result. That was in a slightly different part, not far from where this particular action that we're concerned with now took place, but it was a separate action, if you like, and he would be recommended and awarded the VC by Pompey Elliott in due course. Insofar as Tubbs' action was concerned, despite almost every man of the 10 or so that he had with him being killed or wounded, they managed to cling on, some men being instructed to stand back and catch and hurl back Turkish bombs that were being sent over the barricade. Others were smothering them with sandbags, while Burton and Dunstan, and you'll see a picture here, the 2 men here, Dunstan and Burton, pictured at the lower part on the left, they were trying to rebuild a barrier that had been partially destroyed by a Turkish charge set against it from the other side. As they tried to build the barricade, Tubb was doing his best to hold them off single-handed. Others behind them, who are not in this particular illustration, were, as I say, trying to catch and throw back the Turkish bombs before they exploded. This was an absolutely desperate action, as you can imagine. It went on all night long. And as Tubb single-handedly resisted the Turkish assault, in the course of these actions, Burton was killed, Tubb was wounded, and Dunstan was temporarily blinded, and most of the others with them were either killed or wounded. In the aftermath, their commanding officer, Pompey Elliott, was minded to recommend at least 5 VCs, which was at some point in the chain of recommendation was reduced to 3, with a DCM on top of that. All of these awards were granted, and the Victoria Crosses went to Tubb, Burton, and Dunstan. There may be arguments as to whether there should have been 4 or even 5 VCs, but no one could dispute the level of gallantry shown or the justice in those awards to those 3 men. What is interesting is that Elliott later wrote something about the background to these awards, which shed a bit of light on the whole situation. He stated in a letter written a few weeks later that he had recommended 5 VCs, Tubb, Burton, and Dunstan, as well as Corporals Webb and Wright. Now, these were 2 of the men who had been set the task of catching and throwing back the Turkish grenades. Of these 2, Webb received the Distinguished Conduct Medal. Wright got nothing. This was, you'll see the reasons shortly. Writing to Wright's sister, Elliott observed, "No doubt had your brother lived, he would have got the DCM, if not the VC. There are so many who do brave deeds that it is almost impossible to receive recognition for them." The problem for Wright was that he'd been killed or died of wounds, and so his actions were not recognized at all, because he was not eligible for a Distinguished Conduct Medal, which could not be awarded posthumously at that time. There were also other difficulties with this whole question about awards for such an intense period of action, and this was reflected in a letter that Elliott wrote sometime later, and he said, "Often the bravest things are not seen or reported because all taking part in it are killed or wounded, and the time goes by for sending in the report. Men after a fight appear dazed and disinclined to speak of it unless one gets an inkling of some incident and questions them to bring it out, and often they tell it in such a slow patchwork way that you must get 2 or 3 to get anything like a full account. Each has usually been busy and only gets passing glances of what happens on either side of him. All these things make it difficult to do justice to all. And then the general insists on cutting down the lists that come to him, and injustice occurs here, for often in a big fight, many men do extremely brave things." This was certainly the case. There is no doubt at all that such disparity is far from uncommon. And I'll just go back to we come back to this whole question of whether more should have been awarded, and we have this whole question of disparity, which is shown up in the other case, which I think compares with this particular action. And this is the case, the second action, which was fought a few weeks later at the end of August. It concerned the 10th Australian Light Horse and their attack on Hill 60, and the efforts to hold the position gained against a series of Turkish counterattacks. In the course of this struggle, which was every bit as fierce as the fight at Lone Pine, a small party of light horsemen, commanded by Lieutenant Hugo Throssell, battled to hold a trench block just like Tubb and his band of men at Goldenstets. As before, enemy bombs were repeatedly thrown back, though not without loss. Others fought on with terrible injuries until they were killed or died of their wounds, while throughout, Throssell continued to bear a charmed life, fighting on despite wounds to his left shoulder and neck. I'll just go through some of the pictures quickly here. I'm sorry, this is slightly out of order because this is Tubb, this is Burton, and this is Dunstan, having just received his VC. And here we have a picture of Throssell's action, which, as you can see, is not so dissimilar in some ways from the action in which Tubb, Burton and Dunstan were decorated, and also involved some men who were trying to resist, if you like, the Turkish grenades. As in the case of Tubb at Lone Pine, there was no question that the successful defence had been based on the collective gallantry of a small group of men under the inspirational leadership of Throssell. But this time, there appears to have been no attempts to share the recognition equally. Of the 5 other men whose bravery was highlighted at the time, 3 were awarded DCMs, and the other 2 being denied by their deaths. Such disparity is not uncommon in the history of the VC, where the leader is often selected not so much as the most deserving, but as a representative for all the others. But scrutiny of the action could not fail to show the disparity. Indeed, the 2 actions were almost carbon copies of one another, only in the case of those fighting at Hill 60, equal courage was not matched by equal reward. In fact, in the case of one of the most gallant of all the defenders, it was thoroughly unequal. By common consent, Trooper Sid Ferrier had been the life and soul of the defence, continuing to hurl bombs back at the Turks even after one arm had been all but blown off by an enemy grenade. Overall, it was reckoned he'd thrown some 500 bombs throughout the night-long struggle. Ferrier succumbed to his injuries, and when Throssell's richly deserved VC was announced some weeks later, one of his fellow light horsemen wrote, "I think I know of another who should have had that little honour." And something of that inconsistency, so far as Ferrier was concerned and the others, Webb, etc., at Lone Pine, is reflected in the comparison made by Throssell, no less, of the VC awarded to an officer in France for throwing a single German bomb out of the trench before it had time to explode. This was a George Boyd Rochfort of the Scots Guards. He was throwing back, in fact, a trench mortar bomb rather than a grenade. But whereas Ferrier and others performed what Throssell said, that performed this act repeatedly for many hours, Boyd Rochfort had only thrown one bomb back, and yet they got nothing in comparison. I feel that had Ferrier been recommended, it is difficult to imagine that his actions would not have been deemed worthy of the highest award. But as it was, death robbed him of any distinction, leaving him to join the ranks of the many brave men whose gallantry went unrecognized. I'll leave if you like, the last word to Hugo Throssell. In a letter to Ferrier's mother, he wrote, "I have seen many brave men the last few months, and although there may be plenty of men just as brave, there has never been a braver man than your son. Although your son has not been awarded, so far, any honour, it will be comforting to you to know that in the eyes of his comrades, he earned the Victoria Cross dozens of times over." And I think that sort of, to me, sums up. This particular picture shows Throssell holding the line while the men behind him were building the barricade. Again, very similar to what Tubb did at Lone Pine, only the men who were with him did not get the VCs. That I certainly think at least one should have received a VC, in other words, Sid Ferrier, and possibly others as well. And there is this sense of inconsistency in my mind between that action at Lone Pine and the light horse action on Hill 60. And here we have Throstle in all his finery as a light horseman. And so, yeah, I'm sure if you were to go to, if you look at these cases, there would be probably similar situations that would apply to the story of the stories of Victoria Cross actions on the Western Front and elsewhere. But it strikes me that, you know, this is a particular area that I've studied over many years, and this question of inconsistency is one which I think that it's hard to avoid the sense that there were some serious injustices done. And whilst this is true, I'm sure, of other campaigns, I can't help feeling that there was certain cases here that were strongly, where strong injustices were done, not least to the naval submariners, who I cannot for the life of me understand how they were not awarded, if not the Victoria Cross or the bars to the Victoria Cross, that they were not awarded distinguished service orders. I mean, it's always true to say that subsequent similar actions often don't achieve the same recognition. You have cases where, you know, for airmen during the First World War, you have people who shoot down Zeppelins, and the first man to shoot down a Zeppelin is awarded the Victoria Cross. The second man, possibly for propaganda purposes, is also awarded a Victoria Cross because it takes place over London. Thereafter, the tide of war has changed, and the advantage is more with the aircraft attacking the Zeppelin than it is with the Zeppelin, and the numbers of Zeppelins that are lost goes up, and the number of, and the decorations for the people shooting them down goes down, insofar as that they are awarded a DSO or even a Distinguished Flying Cross or a military cross by the end of the war. So I can understand to a certain extent if the Navy had decided not to want to award a bar to the VC for Nasmyth in particular, or to Robinson, but I simply cannot understand why these men did not at least get awarded a Distinguished Service Order to go alongside their VCs. But I'd, you know, be interested. I mean, it is one of these things where it's can be subjective, and you know, people will have their own opinions. But I'd be interested to know sometimes what other people feel about it. But that's the nature of this this particular talk. So thank you very much for listening, and I hope it's been of interest.